All right, folks. So we're going to be starting a large group screencast here called Obstacles to Peace, Difficulties in Resolving the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Mrs. Clark introduced this idea in lecture um, before the break, and it was how there was a conflict between the newly created state of Israel in 1948 and the Arab people living in the region known as Palestinians from that point onward, from 1948 onward. So we're going to be looking at what has prevented two separate states, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, from coming into existence in this region. One thing that we're going to proceed with in this large group presentation is you're going to be watching a series of clips as this progresses. So look for the boxes that say watch in the right side of the screen, and sometimes it'll be a full screen, and use those video clips to complete the questions that follow in the plan. So the people who lived in the region known as Palestine that the State of Israel was created over in 1948 were the native Arabic-speaking peoples known as Palestinians in that particular region of the world. And one of the reasons that they resent and resist the state of Israel today is that they originally didn't think it was fair that the United Nations, which had newly been created after World War II, created a plan to create this state of Israel and thus take away land from people who had been inhabiting the area up to that point. So that's kind of the Palestinian perspective, that the state of Israel did not have a right to be created by the UN. And they rejected this plan by the UN in 1948, as Mrs. Clark talked about. That was called the Partition Plan, the idea to create a separate Israel and a separate Palestine. This led to what is called the 1948 War for Israeli Independence. And the big result of this 1948 war was that the Arab states, nations like Jordan and Egypt and Syria and others, Arab states who fought against Israel, were on the losing side. They were defeated and Israel won its independence. As a result of that conflict, hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of Palestinian Arabs who resisted the state of Israel became refugees, and they had to live life as refugees in other countries. They had to flee their homeland and live in makeshift communities, in some cases covered by no more than tents. And they requested from that point onward a right of return, the idea that they should be able to come back and return to their original homes in Palestine. Israel, for its part, up to this day, has rejected this idea of a right to return for Palestinians who were displaced in the 1948 war or their descendants. And this is a big sticking point. It's an obstacle to peace. It's also at odds with this idea of UN Resolution 1941. The UN in 1948, the United Nations, which was recently created after World War II, it said that the United Nations General Assembly adopts Resolution 1941, resolving that all refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the properties choosing not to return and for the loss of damage of properties which, under the principles of international law or equity, should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. Many Palestinians will point to this UN resolution to say that they have the right to return to the land that was displaced from them when Israel came into existence. This is some imagery of that time period of the State of Israel being created in 1948. Now, 1948 was one important conflict, but there were other later conflicts between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the broader neighboring Arab states like Jordan or Syria or Egypt. There was what's called the 1967 War. This is a conflict between Israel and the various Arab nations that border it. It was a massive victory for Israel. It resulted in not only Israel getting to retain its own independence, but it gave it full control of what is called the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. These were areas on the map that Mrs. Clark went over on Friday before break. It also opened the door for future Israeli expansion, meaning Israelis could move into areas that were once dominated by Palestinians since they won this 1967 war, most notably the West Bank. So I just want to remind you quickly of the geography we're talking about here. The West Bank, as you can see, is that area to the west of the Jordan River, and it's a very Palestinian-rich region. It was going to be the heart of any future Palestinian nation that would have been created. The Gaza Strip, that smaller strip on the southeastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, is also a very Palestinian-rich region. And the Sinai Peninsula, which was part of Egypt, but was won by Israel in the 1967 war. This led to more displaced Palestinians, meaning they were moved off of their original homes and were forced to kind of live under Israeli occupation. The 1967 war had another big effect in that Israel was in the position of giving up occupied territory and security. Because they won so overwhelmingly in this war, they felt very hesitant about making any future deals with the neighboring Arab states or the Palestinian people to give any land back. So one big obstacle to peace here is going to be this issue of settlements. Settlements are Israelis who move into territories that used to be dominated by Palestinians, most notably the West Bank area on the map. That was very Palestinian rich, but after the 67 war, Israelis started moving in there into communities and buying up land and pushing the Palestinians further and further back. Israel, up to this point, and this goes on even to this day, Israel has already invested billions of dollars in building suburban neighborhoods and infrastructure. And these Israeli settlements are increasingly surrounded by walls and barriers and security checkpoints that keep the Palestinians feeling as though they're strangers in their own homeland. Many Israelis are ideologically invested in having these settlements because they're political symbols as long as they exist as a sign of Israeli strength and permanence to the area. From the Palestinian perspective, they see the settlements as intrusive, degrading, and humiliating. The idea that you have to go through several checkpoints just to get home is a big problem, they would say. And another key sticking point is control over East Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital city. As you know, it has deep religious, historical importance to all groups at hand, both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And East Jerusalem is an area that was historically dominated by Palestinians. But after the 1967 war, Israelis were firmly in control of it, as well as the holy sites. This is an image you saw kind of partially last Friday, which is if you look at the Palestinian population and loss of land from 1946 onward, this is what you see. You see a significant degradation over the course of the next 50 to 60 years. I'd like you to watch this film clip here and use this video to answer questions 2 and 3. This is some imagery of Israeli settlements being constructed in late 2015, 2016. Another big problem, an obstacle to peace that the people of this region face is violence and reprisals. Palestinians have engaged historically in various acts of terrorism, what were called intifadas. These were mass uprisings against the Israelis. There was one in the late 1980s. There was one in the early 2000s. The Palestinian leadership is divided up, however. It doesn't have one central political head. There are different groups. One is called Hamas, which is dominated largely by Sunni Muslims. Another is called Hezbollah, which is dominated by Shia Muslims. Remember, Sunni and Shia are the two different branches of Islam that have a deep history. And then there's a group called Fatah, which is more secular, meaning less religious, more politically based. So negotiating between Israelis and Palestinians can be very complicated because the Palestinians are broken up into these factions. Israeli defense forces, historically, when an attack occurs against Israeli settlers or civilians of any kind, the Israeli military will retaliate very strongly, and in many of these cases it can lead to civilian deaths accidentally. And Palestinians are usually very upset and angry about that, and they look at these deaths as a sign that the Israelis are using disproportionate violence. The Israeli occupation and security checkpoints, you could argue, lead to more violence and reprisals. While they keep people safe in one sense, they also can lead to anger amongst the population and possibly fuel future conflict. There have been some moments of progress in the past 60 years or so. There's what are called the Camp David Accords in 1978, where Israel actually did give back the Sinai Peninsula that it had won in the 67 war back to Egypt, who had attacked it and was historically an enemy of Israel. But after 1978, Egypt and Israel kind of came to a more agreeable diplomatic relationship between each other, and they've been relatively peaceful ever since. In the early 1990s, there was a big flurry of hope that things were getting better. There were these agreements and meetings called the Oslo Accords, where the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin agreed to reduce Israeli settlements. But this was never really put into effect because Rabin was assassinated a little over a year later. In the early 2000s, there was a little bit of an uptick. President Bill Clinton, U.S. President Bill Clinton, called a meeting between the Israelis and the Palestinians at Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland, where he got both sides nearly to an agreement. You see President Clinton there in the lower right and President Jimmy Carter in the upper right. In 2005, there was an attempt again. Israelis withdrew some settlements from the Gaza Strip, but it led to a series of violent outbreaks, and it really kind of cast doubt on whether or not the Israelis could really pull back their settlements in the future, considering this one little act in 2005 led with so much violence. Are there possible peace deals? Meaning, in the future, would there be any way out of this? Well, one peace deal is what is called the two-state solution. This has been talked about really since the beginning. It was the original idea of the United Nations, which is to have two separate states that would exist there. The two-state solution, if it were to work, would involve creating a Palestinian nation that was a combination of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then they would be linked together with land corridors. It'd be kind of a weird-looking nation state, but a lot of people think that maybe this could work. That would, of course, call into question all of those Israeli settlements that exist in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So a lot of people, while they may still talk about a two-state solution, it's a big question of whether it could work. Another solution is what's called the one-state solution, which is all of Israel would get combined, the Israeli population and the Palestinian population, and they would just grant universal citizenship to everyone, and it would become a multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy. And then there's kind of what we have going on, which is the hybrid solution of today, which is a hybridized Israeli occupation with local Palestinian administration and control in parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, with Israeli military kind of guarding all of the crossover points. So these are the possible peace deals that could eventually lead to peace between these groups. Some recent developments, I'd like you to watch this video in the upper right to complete question 4. There's also a video in the lower right if you wanted to add further context to that. As it was leaving office, the Obama administration had some hope that it might be able to create a framework for a two-state solution peace deal, but it ended up not happening. The Israeli prime minister, who's still the prime minister to this day, Benjamin Netanyahu, has resisted efforts to remove West Bank settlers. And as long as that is the case, a lot of analysts to this problem say that a two-state solution really couldn't work, that Israeli settlers would have to go. Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, recently was indicted for bribery, so there's a big question over whether or not he'll remain the Israeli prime minister. I'd like you to think about all of these as you answer these questions, and remember, all of these questions are going to be due by Friday, and you're going to have Wednesday as a work day on them. Please do not hesitate to ask us if you have any questions.